Welcome back to our study in the book of Genesis. We're looking at Genesis 7:16, and we're going to talk about the flood. A great flood begins, Genesis 6-8. When the flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark, so that it rose above the earth, the water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the water, and the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds, cattle, beasts, and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth. All mankind, of all that was on the dry land, all in those nostrils with the breath of the Spirit of life, died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things to birds in the sky. They were blotted out from the earth. And only Noah was left, together with those who were with him in the ark, and the water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. God tells Noah to get in the boat, because in 7 days it's going to rain. On the 7th day the rain began. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. The great flood thus began the greatest catastrophe this world has ever seen. The springs of the great deep burst forth. The great fault along the middle of the Atlantic Ocean probably ruptured, spewing superheated subterranean water high into the air. This caused the vapor canopy to condense and form water droplets, which then fell in mighty torrents for 40 days and nights. As the mid-Atlantic ridge probably raised up and opened up, the continents slid apart quickly down the steep slopes. In this animation we see the water from the inside the earth and the water from above the earth combining to cover the earth in a great flood. "40 days and 40 nights of rain that came and did not stop as the waters rose and flooded and choked the very life of all flesh. The ark was borne up on the waters, and those within were safe, while death reigned just beyond the wooden beams and planking. 40 days and 40 nights, a number that had particular significance to the original readers of Moses' manuscript. They also had undergone a period of testing that lasted 40 days and 40 nights. This was a period during which Moses had gone up into the Mount Sinai to receive the law of God. This was how long Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. He faced the desert and dry places. He faced the destructive judgment of God as was poured out and rained upon him. He died for us, that we might find life in him. Instead of a flood, the people of Israel had found themselves in a desert before the mountain of God. It served as a reminder that there had once been a time when all of the mountains were covered. Such was the power of the Lord that this mountain could be swept away, hidden by the flood of his might. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, all mankind, everything on the dry land that had breath of life in its nostrils, died. As we read this section of the narrative, they will be impressed by the description that emphasizes the universality of the judgment. While this doesn't necessarily mitigate against the theory of a largely localized flood, it emphasizes the universality of the judgment. The waters lifted the ark above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased upon the earth. The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. All the high hills were covered. The water rose 15 cubits above the mountains. All flesh died upon the earth. The waters prevailed for 150 days. The scriptures could not be more emphatic. They go so far in verse 21 as to name all of the different categories of life that died, and then to rename them again in verse 23. The repetition is given for the sake of emphasis. It is that we should not miss the point that all animal and human life died in the flood. It seems obvious from Genesis 7:19 and 20 that the author intended to describe a worldwide and not a local flood. The expression "all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered," the waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 20 feet, show that this was indeed a global flood. No one can know how high any mountain was at that time. It's unlikely that even a tree would have survived underwater burial for 150 days. Speaking of trees, it has been said that the trees that grew before the flood would not have growth rings, since there were probably no seasonal slowdowns and restarts of spring growth in the tropical climate that is thought to have existed before the flood. Some argue for a local flood. They say earth, land, often refers to a specific locality. Mesopotamia has only relatively low hills, therefore could be easily flooded. All should need 8 times the water on earth for a universal flood. Yet the text, under the whole sky and heavens, this gives the local flood position a problem. How could the ark land on Ararat if there was not enough water? Water came up as well as down, therefore plate geology must have been involved. Some object to local flood on the grounds of it seems to be logical impossibilities. Some skeptics object to flood because the water would have had to go somewhere after the flood. Skeptic Bill Butler says if the Earth's surface was covered by an additional 20,000 feet of water, how would you get rid of that, he says. The scriptures indicate that around the time of the flood, God altered the Earth's topography. Massive underground bodies of water have also been discovered by scientists. Scientists scanning the deep interior of the Earth have found evidence of a vast water reservoir beneath eastern Asia. This is at least the volume of the Arctic Ocean. This discovery marks for the first time such a large body of water found in a planet's deep mantle. How much more is there out there waiting to be discovered? Evolutionists have certainly had their impact on our perception of ancient people and cultures. If the flood was only a localized flood, why bother saving all the animals? There would have been plenty left in all the other parts of the earth. Local flood believers say that it only means that they save the animals and species in their local area, not from all over the world. Universal flood believers say if Mesopotamian water covered hills by 22 feet at 6 meters or more, much of the rest of the world would also have been covered. 8 foot of layer of clean watery clay. Facts have been gathered from various sources which point to the truthfulness of the Bible as it records a great flood. In recent years, excavations by archaeologists in various regions of the earth have revealed evidence of a great flood. In separate excavations, an 8 foot layer of clean watery clay has been found with artifacts of older civilizations buried underneath. In many places, marine fossils have been discovered on the tops of mountains. The fossil record supports the flood of the Bible. One of the most peculiar parts of the fossil record is the presence of dinosaur graveyards all over the world. Places where large numbers of dinosaurs all died around the same time and were buried very quickly together. Consider some quotes concerning these fossil beds. Theophylact lived during the late Triassic period, about 210 million years ago, at a time when northern Mexico was an arid, low-lead environment. Periodic monsoonal rains interrupted the dry conditions, producing flash floods that swept across the land. One of these flash floods may have drowned an entire herd, causing a great concentration of bones that is found at the Ghost Ranch. The fossil bones are strewn throughout an ancient flood deposits in Chile's desert, suggesting there were animals or corpses caught up in a flood, perhaps 110 million years ago, at the beginning of the Cretaceous period. These have been found on the Isle of Wight. Paleontologist Dave Martle of Portsmouth feels that as many as 5,000 specimens exist on the island, all of which were drowned when trapped in a tremendous flash flood. The Sahara Desert we know today that would not have existed in the day the animal would have populated an area covering open forests and broad rivers. It looks as though the dinosaurs may have been caught in an ancient flash flood and buried quickly. After a seasonal flood, this scene of 145 million years ago is based on clues found in the rock face behind you. Carcasses brought downstream by the fast-moving muddy water were washed onto a sandbar. Some were buried completely by tons of sand, their bones preserved in a nearly perfect state. These dinosaur graveyards appear all over the world. yet scientists still insist on calling them regional floods. The simplest fossils are formed when the dead body of an animal falls into mud or silt of a lake or a swamp. The soft parts of the animal gradually rot away to leave hard bones. These are slowly covered by layers of mud which are dropped or deposited by rivers. As more and more layers of mud are added to the bottom layers are turned into rock by the pressure of the underlying sediment. This doesn't happen in real life. A slow degradation of an animal fossil, then being covered slowly with the bones. Fossilization can happen very quickly. This manufacturer confirmed that the particular stitching pattern in this boot dates, if no earlier, than the mid-1950s, and yet inside is found a fossilized femur. Amazing. Dead bodies are not broken down over time. They're broken down by insects in a very short period of time. This is one of the biggest bodies you can get. Here's an elephant. This second picture was taken only 7 days after the first. How do you think the elephant could have decomposed so quickly? Frozen mastodons in the northern Siberia and beyond, well above the Arctic Circle, were found with undigested food in stomachs and in mouths, far from any suitable range where they would normally be found. Even many non-religious authorities suggest they were carried there by water. The great coal and petroleum deposits. This is a coal seam. The Great Flood may explain the huge deposits of coal and oil that exist around the world. Any kind of organic matter, when buried under tons of sediment and subjected to heat from inside the earth, can quickly change to hydrocarbon compounds like coal and oil. Under laboratory conditions, we can make coal in 4 months. Landfills, rubbish dumps, are often used today to generate natural gas and oil. There's also references to a great flood among the historical legends of the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Greeks, among present-day Mexicans, the South Sea Islanders, and many more. The existence of so many flood legends all throughout the ancient cultures is evidence in itself. When legends exist in different places with very similar elements, it points to some real event. This doesn't mean that all the details of every legend is true, just that they likely resulted from some common real event in the past. There are over 500 flood legends throughout the ancient cultures, with striking similarities to the Bible account of the flood. Here's just a few of them. Notice all the different nations involved. In many of the cases, these legends clearly existed among people long before Bibles were ever part of their culture. The Aztecs. Only 2 people, the hero Coxcox and his wife, survived the flood by floating in a boat that came to rest on a mountain. Soon after it, giants built a great pyramid to try to reach the heavens. This angered the gods, who scattered them with fire. Toltecs. A flood destroyed the first world 1,716 years after it was created. Only a few people escaped. This means closed chest. Later they built a high tower in case another flood came. At this time the languages were confused and they separated different parts of the world. Another ancient tribe of Mexico tells of Tespe, a man who escaped the flood in a boat filled with animals. He sent out a scavenger bird that never returned, then a dove that came back with an olive leaf, then a hummingbird that brought back a twig. China. People in Nosu have a legend that God sent a personal messenger to this world to warn 3 sons that a flood was coming. Only the youngest, Dum, listened. He built a wooden boat to prepare for the flood. When a flood came, he entered his boat and was saved. When the waters receded, the boat rested on Mount Tibet, where Dum had 3 sons who repopulated the earth. The book of Genesis, not written until hundreds of years after the flood, the story was passed down through word of mouth. Moses wrote by inspiration, and also it is important to ask a question: why was the Bible story told after, for example, the Gilgamesh epic. Moses speaking to a new nation of Israel who had just escaped Egyptian slavery and idolatry and are about to enter the promised land. Scattered people would have taken their history with them. Over time the details would have changed as it was repeated. The account would vary among the nations. Again we see the Chinese language bearing this out. Humans became very wicked, Greek mythology says. Zeus wanted to destroy the humans by a flood and create another group. Before he does this, a man named Deucalion and his wife Brina were warned of a coming destruction. They were placed in a large wooden chest by one of the mortals named Prometheus. For 9 days and nights the waters covered almost all the earth. Only a few mountain peaks remained. The wooden chest came to rest on the peak of Mount Parnassus. When Deucalion left the chest, he made a sacrifice to Zeus. The Ibans of Sarawak. A trio floated around in an ark with his wife and domestic animals. The native of India, a man named Manu, built an ark after being warned. A great flood came. Later the waters receded and the ark rested on a mountain. Southwest Tanzania. Once upon a time the rivers began to flood. The god told 2 people to get into a ship. He told them to take lots of seed and take lots of animals. The water of the flood eventually covered the mountains. Finally the flood stopped. Then one of the men wanted to know if the water had dried up. Let a dove loose. The dove returned. Later let loose a hawk, which did not return. Then the men left the boat and took the animals and seeds with them. Australia. There was a legend of a flood called the Dreamtime Flood. Riding on this flood was the Waramba, or the Ark Gumana. In this ark was Noah, Aborigines and various animals. This ark eventually came to rest in the plain of where they still can be found. They claim that the white man's story about the ark landing in the Middle East is a lie that was started to keep the Aborigines in subservience. This legend is undoubtedly the product of Aboriginal legends merging with those of visiting missionaries, and there does not appear to be any native flood stories from Australia. Delaware Indians in the pristine age, the world lived at peace. But an evil spirit came and caused a great flood. The earth was submerged. A few persons had taken refuge in the back of a turtle. So old was its shell, it had collected moss. A loon flew over their heads and entreated to dive beneath the water and bring up land. It found only a bottomless sea. Then the bird flew far away and came back with a small portion of earth in its bill and guided the tortoise to a place where there was a spot of dry land. Among the number of flood traditions that have come down to us from a number of ancient cultures, probably the most popular of these is one found in Gilgamesh epic. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a long Akkadian poem on the theme of human beings' futile quest for immortality. A number of earlier Sumerian stories about Gilgamesh, the quasi-historical hero of the epic, were used as sources, but the Akkadian work was composed about 2000 BC. It exists in several different renditions, none of them complete. In the story, Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu seek immortality through fame, but when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh finds that fame to be hollow. Unable to accept the finality of death, he goes to Upnapishtim, the Babylonian counterpart of the biblical Noah, to learn the secret of his immortality. This interview takes place on the 5th of 7 tablets. He tells the story of how he was spared the destruction of the great flood through the building of a giant square barge. The boat consists of 7 decks and overlaid with pitch. It took only 7 days to build it. He saved his family and relatives along with animals and craftsmen. The flood began when the gods of the abyss rose up. Nergal pulled out the dams of the nether waters. Nanutra, the warlord, threw down the dikes, and the 7 judges of hell, the Anukai, raised their torches, lighting the land with a livid flame. The storm lasted for 6 days and nights, after which the surface of the sea stretched as flat as a rooftop. The boat landed on top of the mountain of Nisar. After 7 days on the mountain, he released a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven before leaving the boat and making a sacrifice to the gods. He goes on to explain he received it due to the unique circumstances of flood, but he consoles the dejected Gilgamesh with news about a plant of life. A snake swallows the plant before Gilgamesh can use it, and he finally returns home reluctantly accepting death without future resurrection as inevitable. What do we make of the fact that a document predating the book of Genesis by hundreds of years also contains a story of a flood with many of the same aspects of the biblical account? Some have argued that this is proof that the biblical narratives are adopted from pagan myths and have no bearing on truth. I believe it demonstrates just the opposite. It is an independent testimony to the truth of the actual events. Whether local or universal, this was definitely a supernatural event, unique in human history. The credibility of the flood narrative depends on whether we spell God with a capital G or a little g. It depends on whether we believe in God or not. Destruction of the human race. Physical death is not the worst thing that can happen to someone. Sodom and Gomorrah raise the same question. Is God justified when he judges human sin? He will do so again. 1 Peter 3 says, "For Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God." When God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built, in it only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. This symbolized baptism that now saves you, not the removal of death from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience towards God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The ark is ready. Noah and his family and pairs of every kind of land animal and winged animal in the ark. 7 pairs of clean animals and birds. God shut the door, and the rain began. The fountains of the great deep, the ocean, broke open. The subterranean water burst forth. The whole earth is flooded to a depth that covered the tallest mountain by 20 feet. The rain will fall for 40 days, and the flood will cover the earth for 150 days. Noah's ark was lifted up high above the land by the waters of the flood. The same waters which destroyed the wicked and cleansed the earth also served to save those who were in the ark. Just as those who were saved then were in God's ark, today those who are saved are in God's spiritual family, his kingdom, his body, the church. After 150 days, the waters began slowly to subside. Finally, the waters receded and the ark rested on Mount Ararat. The 40 days and nights of torrential rains are over. All the animals of land and air and all humans left outside the great ark have died. All inside the ark are growing more impatient by the day to get out into the world again. We noted in an earlier session that the statement that God remembered Noah stands as a pivotal point in the chaotic structure of the entire narrative. Everything from this point will be an echo of the previous destruction and will involve a movement to restoration and renewal of the creation. This is a wonderful picture of salvation. When it seems as though God had turned his back on all life, both animal and man, God remembered Noah. The point is not that God had been forgetful, but to understand the exact opposite, underscore the exact opposite. That Noah had not been forgotten. The ark had not slipped God's mind. The 40 days and nights are over. All animals of land and air and all humans left outside the great ark have died. All inside the ark are growing more impatient by the day to get out. God sent a wind over the earth to dry up the waters. Evaporation could not possibly account for the removal of so much water, but it would help by taking much of the vapor back up into the atmosphere. Other forces must have been at work that are not explained. The blowing of the wind would help to increase evaporation and even the distribution of the waters. It would also dry the ground once it appeared, but this may not be the only reason for the mention of the wind. Remember the state of the original earth at the time of creation? It was unformed and unfilled, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving upon the face of the waters. There's a play of words here, in that the word for spirit and the word for wind is the same word, ruach. The description is deliberately designed to view this restoration from flood as a new creation. God is doing again what he did at the beginning. He's again bringing life from hopelessness, from lifelessness. The ark comes to rest. Exactly 5 months from the time the flood began, the boat came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. The ark came to rest in the mountains in the Ararat range, exactly 5 months or 150 days after the flood began. The Hebrew months were 30 days long. We're not told that Ararat was the name of the mountain in which the ark landed. Instead, it's the name of the country in which the mountains are located. This land is mentioned in 2 Kings 19:37 and Isaiah 37:38, where the assassins of Sennacherib escape to the land of Arat. This evidently refers to a portion of the land of Armenia. Its ancient name among the Assyrians was Araratu. Run wide, archaeologists found huge drogue stones, a stone altar with a step 36 inches high, and the impression of what could be a huge boat on one of the mountains of Ararat. He found other things that could be referred to Noah and his family there. Check out the story in the photographs on the internet. The raising of the land, surfaces and mountains and the attendant deepening of the ocean basins is not described or explained. It must have been a gradual process, so the waters would recede slowly enough so as not to cause a tsunami or other catastrophic effect on the ark and its inhabitants. Noah tests the environment outside the ark by sending out his feathered scouts. Soon God will bring him out to make a new start on a cleansed earth. Noah sent out the raven and the dove the first time 294 days after the beginning of the flood. The raven is a soaring bird that can ride the thermal updrafts for days. Noah looked down from the height. Must have been found it hard to see any valleys below. Naturally, Noah would not want to let the animals go into the danger of drowning until the danger of drowning was gone, so he waited until the water was gone from the lower elevations. The dove finds no high ground. Then he sends out a dove to see if water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water over all the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself. He waited 7 more days and again sent the dove out from the ark. When the dove returned in the evening, its beak was full of a freshly plucked olive tree. Then Noah knew water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it didn't return to him. The olive leaf on the 31st day of the Great Flood. Was this olive leaf from a pre-flood tree or from a newly sprouted olive tree? Remember, it had been 54 days since Noah had seen the tops of the mountains. When Noah sent out the dove the 3rd time and didn't return, Noah knew the surface of the ground was dry in areas. If the flood waters covered the whole earth to a depth of 20 feet above the highest mountains and remained in the earth for 150 days, where did all that water go after the flood? The vapor canopy couldn't reconstitute itself. The subterranean water probably didn't go back where it was. So what happened to all that water? It's probably God simply deepened the ocean basins at the same time, raising the land higher than it had been before. If the mountains became significantly higher after the flood, and the ocean basins became significantly deeper, especially the Pacific Basin, that would logically provide room for the waters to remain on the earth yet leave the continents high and dry. Remember, this would be a miracle. It doesn't require a naturalistic explanation. If the flood began on the 17th day of the 7th month and ended on the 27th day of the 2nd month, a year later, the passengers had been in the ark 7 days before the flood began. How long had they been in the ark? A year, 17 days. They are ready to come out. The first thing Noah did after leaving the ark was to worship God according to the commandments of God must have given Adam as part of the first covenant. The clean animals were those used for sacrifice. God was pleased and said to himself he would never again destroy all living things in a flood. And Noah built an altar. The flood account and the creation account. There is a sense in which the chapters are setting forth the culmination recovery from flood and echo the events of Genesis 1, as the Lord moves to bring a recreation to the world following the destruction of the flood. In Genesis 1, waters covered the earth. Genesis 7, flood waters cover the earth. Genesis 1, the Spirit hovers over the water. Genesis 7, the dove hovers over the water. Genesis 1, dry land comes forth with vegetation on the 3rd day. Genesis 7, dove returns with olive leaf, indicating dry land, chapter 8, verse 11. Genesis 1, creation finished and God rests. and in Genesis 8, restoration is finished. God receives the sacrifice of rest. The promise. As part of the new covenant God made with mankind through Noah, he promised to never again bring a worldwide flood to drown mankind. The earth will be destroyed by fire someday, but not before the Christians, living and dead, are taken up to be with Jesus in the air. Seasons are now coming into effect. Some commentators think the seasons didn't exist before the flood. They're not mentioned except as marked by the heavenly bodies. The idea might be that after the seasons had come into existence with 230-degree listing of the earth occurred in the flood, that what we now call the signs of the zodiac would be used to mark the seasons. If you found something useful in this lesson, please feel free to come back and join us. Every blessing.